Okay, thank you so much, everybody attending either now or later on over YouTube. And thank you as always to the organizers in Tautagalation for these Comreta, and above all to Kuno Balanos. I hope you feel better. It's so great to have these kinds of events where we can get together and nerd out over things Gaulish and related that are not necessarily Gaulish specific, and share perspectives and ritual and so on. So I'm really excited to present today about these kind of lesser known, but in my opinion, really key goddesses, the Suleviae. So before I begin, let me introduce myself. My name's Owen, or for religious purposes, Viducus Brigantici Filius. I'm the possibly evil genius behind the website deomercurio.be, which is particularly relevant in this case, as my page about the Suleviae on Deo Mercurio is still, I think, one of the better introductions on the internet to these goddesses, their historic attestations, and the context of their ancient worship, though I say it myself. Yes, there is. Haven't gotten there yet. So the question was, is there a presentation? Yes. In fact, I'll get to the organization of how this all works presently. But first, I'd also like to acknowledge that I am giving this presentation and ritual on land traditionally belonging to the Potawatomi people, their allies, the Ojibways and Ottawas, and other peoples, notably the Sauk's, Foxes, Miamis, and Kickapoos. To all of them, it is sacred. And I humbly call upon the spirits of this land and the ancestral spirits buried hereabouts and the deities worshipped by those nations to give leave for this presentation and ritual to unfold here. I'm going to divide this session into 3 parts, a kind of FAQ, a little exploration of the iconography of the lovely Suleviae depiction I commissioned from Atamikata or Nesquidley, and finally a ritual portion for which you, the viewer, are very welcome to join in and make offerings. So hence why I'm kind of partly doing a screen share with the presentation and partly me being live. So I'm doing a drink offering of mead as well as an offering of incense, and you can feel free to go grab a drink or something else as an offering while I'm babbling. There are going to be 2 places where I'll pause for questions or comments. So if any occur to you, then feel free to add them to the chat, and Kuno Balanos has been kind enough to offer to keep an eye on the chat, which I won't very consistently. Okay, so get my slideshow going. So the first 2 parts, I'm going to be sharing my screen. And voila. Okay, so for basic information and historic context, I probably can't improve on what I've already written on the Suleviae pages on my website. So I won't rehash all of the material that's on there. And knowing this audience, you might possibly have already given those pages a gander. I know we're a bunch who like to do their own research, as the saying goes. So instead, what I'll do is structure this first portion as answers to a series of questions about these goddesses that often come up. But just first, to establish a baseline, let me state that Suleviae, singular, or the Suleviae, plural, are Romano-Celtic goddesses known from numerous inscriptions in Gaul, the Germanic provinces, Britain, the city of Rome, and Dacia, so quite widespread. But they seem to occupy a somewhat humble role from the point of view of their worshippers. Their altars are generally modest, and they tend to be named low on the list of inscriptions naming larger numbers of deities, mostly in the company of genii, Junos, and those goddesses named the campestres, or field goddesses. To quote the concluding sentences of my page on theomercurio.be, overall, the picture of the Suleviae that emerges is of guardian spirits who govern the destinies of households and individuals. Their character is beneficent and intimate, even motherly. But at the same time, the function of governing and leading suggests the possibility that the Suleviae may at times have wider scope, possibly along the lines of Celtic sovereignty goddesses. And the Suleviae also have a relationship with Minerva and with the matres, or mother goddesses, that I'll delve into directly. Okay, so first question. What is the relationship between Sulis and the Suleviae? So it used to be assumed that the Suleviae were basically Sulis's mini-me's, in the same way that there is Pan and the Panisci, Faunus and the Fauni, Sylvanus and the Silvani. It was formerly thought that the Suleviae were the more localized, subordinate emanations of the goddess Sulis. And who can blame the generation of scholars who thought so? After all, both names start with the letters S-U-L. Strictly speaking, though, this is probably a coincidence because the name Sulis has the root sul, whereas in the name Sulevia, the sul part is probably a prefix meaning good and not part of the root. Meanwhile, the root is now widely thought to be lew, which geeks like me who taught themselves Welsh as teenagers will recognize as the same root as in thew, rudder, and llywydd, leader. So Sulevia could be interpreted to mean good helmswoman, good pilot, good leader, that sort of thing. So hence the short answer, the Suleviae are probably not the mini-me's of Sulis, at least not to start out with. And yet there remains the fact that one of the places where an altar was dedicated to the Suleviae was Bath, Aquae Sulis, the cult center par excellence of Sulis Minerva. We don't know a whole lot about this, but the inscription on the altar includes some tantalizing hints. The dedicant was a peregrine, in other words, not a Roman citizen, who identifies himself as a sculptor. And his name is interesting. It's Sulinus Bruchetti Filius. Sculptors are exactly the sort of skilled artisan who in the Roman Empire often moved around from place to place. And wouldn't you know it, we can see Sulinus, son of Bruchetius, dedicating another altar to the Suleviae, 50-odd kilometers away at Cisater. This isn't a huge distance, obviously, but this fellow was plainly on the move. So wherever he was introduced to the cultus of the Suleviae, it is possible that Sulinus Bruchetti undertook to link it with the cultus at Aquae Sulis, and thus, at least indirectly, with Sulis Minerva herself, maybe traveling to Bath for that very purpose. And his own name, Sulinus, might mean Sulis related or dedicated to Sulis, or more boring, having good eyesight. So our sculptor might have been pretty steeped in Sulis lore while being, as we have seen, a serious worshiper of the Suleviae. And there's one other fact I'd like to bring to bear here, which is the altar from Collias at the south of France, commemorating a vow fulfilled to Sulevia, another possible deity, Edenica or Ledenica, and drumroll Sulevia, drumroll Minerva. So it's quite possible that Sulevia worshippers generally recognize some kind of relationship between that goddess and Minerva. the latter being perhaps the patron or colleague of the former, maybe somewhat like Mercury's relationship with Alades. It's impossible to say for sure, but go off with informed speculation or unverified personal gnosis. For example, P. Sufenas Virius Lupus addresses Sulis as the greatest of Suleviae in the Felupic hymns, which I find intriguing. Okay. Can you see, sorry, can viewers see the whole of these slides, or are they kind of cut off by the little pictures of us all on the side?
I don't think they're cut off.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, anyway, cool. All right. So my next question then is, are the Suleviae mother goddesses? Here, I think the most straightforward answer is not always. At Colchester, there is an altar that's dedicated to the Matres Suleviae, which certainly seems to identify the Suleviae as Matres. On the other hand, inscriptions from Bonn and Xanten are dedicated to the Suleviae and Matres, and to the Matres and Suleviae, respectively, which implies that these are related but distinct sets of deities. And that's where I come down on the question most of the time in my own practice. Now, just to complicate things, there is a set of dedications made in the city of Rome by the Equites Singulares Augusti that include a great long list of deities, usually concluding with Eponae Matribus Sulevis et Genio Singularium Augusti. In other words, to Epona, the mothers, the Suleviae, and the genius of the Singulares Augusti. What an argument for comma usage. Should we read Matribus Sulevis together, the mothers Suleviae, or separately, the mothers, comma, the Suleviae? This is textbook eats, shoots, and leaves. Unfortunately, ancient Latin inscriptions don't use commas, so we honestly can't be sure. But I will say that these Equites Singulares Augusti inscriptions don't go in for a lot of epithets on the whole. They're mainly name, except for the very first, Jupiter, best and greatest. One late dedication by a decurion of the Singulares Augusti is, however, I think, more explicit about distinguishing the two. It's dedicated, get this, Matribus paternis et maternis meisque Sulevis, to the paternal and maternal mothers, and to my own Suleviae, or the fatherly and motherly mothers, you could say. So, to my mind, the evidence best supports the idea that even for the Equites Singulares Augusti, the Suleviae and Matres are closely linked, but usually distinct sets of deities. Usually distinct, but remember our friend from Colchester, for whom the two sets are identified. So if you associate the Matres with nurturing, protecting, safeguarding, these certainly seem like domains where the Matres and the Suleviae can productively collaborate. And this brings me to my next question: Suleviae, singular or plural? Or specifically, what does it imply for Suleviae to be worshipped in the plural compared to the singular? In the plural, my working theory is that this is similar to invoking the Matres or Matronae, the nymphs or the campestres or field goddesses. You're talking about the broad category. You might have, say, 3 or 4 particular nymphs in front of mind, but the invocation is open and potentially inclusive of others within the same category. But what should we make of a dedication to one singular Suleviae? This might imply the one supreme headmost Suleviae, like Pan vis-a-vis the Panisci, or Silvanus vis-a-vis the Silvani. Or it might just mean kind of the most local kind of nearby friendly Suleviae to me. I tend to think that there is an arch Sulevia, and possibly this is who is intended in the invocations to Dea Sulevia, the goddess Sulevia, on a couple of altars from Trier and Alzai. But most individual invocations, with a handful of exceptions, are to the Suleviae plural. And at least some of those dedications in the plural were evidently intended for the most local, the most intimate, the most individual level Suleviae. As we've seen, our friend the Decurion of the Singularis Augusti invokes my Suleviae, while 3 plaques and an altar in present-day Switzerland and Cologne are to their Suleviae, which makes sense as they're in the third person plural. I read such inscriptions to Suleis Suis as implying to the specific Suleviae who look after me, who guide me, or us, since these are groups of people, who steer us on the right course. By the way, if you're wondering what relationship the plural Suleviae might have to each other, one possible answer is provided by an inscription at Ladenburg, which is to the Suleviae Sorores, or the sister Suleviae. So that's kind of nice. And it also implies that this isn't the multi-generational maiden mother crone sort of paradigm. So do all people have their own Suleviae? I mean, maybe. This would make sense if there were reason to think that Suleviae were like a person's genius or Juno. On the subject of which, by the way, I've often wondered if there really is a distinct genius or Juno for every soul, or are genii and Junos so powerful and capable that, like Scarlett Johansson's character in the movie Her, they're able to have deep, committed relationships with infinite numbers of individual souls. That question aside, we do have one inscription from Chainxin where the Suleviae are explicitly invoked as Suleviae Junones. Ding, ding, ding. We probably would have gotten this idea about the Suleviae on the basis of other evidence, but here's a pretty definitive indication that the Suleviae, at least according to this one dedicant, belong to that category of protecting tutelary spirits. Now, a Juno, grossly speaking, can be thought of as a feminine genius. But contrary to the received idea that men have genii and women have Junos, an idea that has been insisted on a bit too rigidly anyhow, most of the people who dedicated inscriptions to the Suleviae actually have masculine names. So there's no reason to think there's any particular gender discrimination in the Suleviae's case. Identification with the Junones, by the way, also links the Suleviae indirectly back to the Matronae. Since there were inscriptions to the Junones Matronae in Italy, while in Lower Germany, there are mother goddesses, such as the Gabiae, who could be identified both as Junones and as Matronae. Talking of genii brings me to the next question. Are the Suleviae tied to place, as some genii seem to be? Two things make me think, in some cases, maybe. Excuse me, the fact that we have invocations of Suleviae montanae, or mountain Suleviae, and Suleviae domesticae, household Suleviae. But I would argue that a deity can be domestica while still being able to move from one home to another like people do. I should also mention that the word montanae is abbreviated, so might not mean what we think it means. Those caveats aside, it's also quite possible that the Gauls conceived of a variety of types of Suleviae, much as the Romans recognized many types of genius. So you'd have an individual's genius or Juno, genius of place, and genii of corporations or neighborhoods, or, as we've seen, military units like the Equites Singulares Augusti. And of course, deities have genii, genius of victory, genius of Apollo, and so on. And so this could be where the Suleviae might intersect with goddesses of sovereignty. So you had Suleviae of a deity of power. If you can have Suleviae of a mountain, why not Suleviae of a country? Here, though, I'm getting into speculation. There's no historic evidence for that that I am aware of. Okay, and that brings me to my final question then. What does good helmswoman really mean? So, lest there be any confusion, there's almost nothing to directly link the Suleviae with literal ocean-going or riverine navigation, so my references to rudders and helms and piloting are metaphorical. But what a metaphor! Instead, I believe it's fair to ascribe to the Suleviae a general overseeing of the course of fate in our lives, with the ability to moderate, guide, and direct the affairs of mortals. There's a similar idea expressed in an ancient text, which is possibly from Roman Gaul. In the play Querulus, one of the characters is the lar familiaris. He explains his role like this: Decreta fatorum ego tempero. I temper or regulate the decrees of fate. I feel that the Suleviae do much the same, with potentially the distinction that they may oversee individuals and not just places, and hence, presumably, can accompany us wherever we roam, unlike the lar in Querulus, who says he's tied to that house. Okay, so this ends the first portion of this session. So are there any questions in the chat before we take a look at iconography?
Nothing that I can see that's a question. A lot of comments.
Okie dokie. On to iconography then. So, oh, and by the way, folks, you're going to have one more chance to ask questions as we go through, so feel free. Okay, so with all due respect to our friend Sulinus Bruchetti Filius and the other ancient worshippers of the Suleviae, who were content with very simple and iconic dedications to the sister Junos, I really wanted to commission a depiction of Suleviae. The most elaborate Suleviae monuments that I've seen have at most some vegetal motifs on the side of the altar, like laurel trees, for example, which for Roman altars is nothing too distinctive or evocative. So I was delighted when Atanikata accepted the commission. In her inimitable style, here's what she produced. The goddess, as you can see in this slide, is wearing Gallo-Roman attire. She has red hair done up in a Roman hairstyle with a crown of laurel leaves. Her right hand holds a rudder, which immediately places her in dialogue with Fortuna as a deity who governs the fates of mortals, and also references her name's likely Celtic etymology. In other words, lots of things in this depiction are expressive of a Gallo-Roman idea, with an interplay of classical and Celtic elements. To reinforce the idea of leading the way, I originally thought of putting a torch in her left hand, but this inescapably makes one think of Ceres, or I suppose Cautes and Cautapates, or deities like that, none of whom are all that closely connected with the Suleviae as far as we know. I felt that the torch wasn't right. And after some divination and a last minute change that Atamikata was extremely accommodating about, we put a bell in Sulevia's left hand instead. The bell is otherwise a powerful symbol of cleansing, of calling home, and of announcing turning point events. Bells are also associated with dairy cattle in mountain regions such as Switzerland, where Sulevia's cultus is well represented. So I thought the mountain and prosperity references worked well too. And her facial expression is great as well. Atamikata depicts Sulevia as a goddess who gives no fucks, which also feels right. Now, this image, as you can see, of course, just depicts one Suleviae rather than 2 or 3 sisters. So possibly an occasion for another commission in the future. Who knows? Okay, so are there any questions before we begin the ritual portion?
I can see there's a question, a more of a speculation if there might be a widespread idea that a group of divine or otherworldly women oversee the threads of fate.
Well, absolutely, sure. Yeah, no, exactly. And I do kind of see the Suleviae as being part of that kind of I guess family of deities in a way that so okay, if you have a picture of like sort of the fates, the Moirai or the Norns or whatever, you're kind of thinking of like a sort of central fate authority that is in charge of like cutting the threads of people's lives over time. And whereas at least my picture of a Suleviae, and this might be wrong, is that they're kind of lower down on the, or sort of more specialized, less centralized in administering to people's fates and destinies. So maybe they're not doing the actual snipping of the threads, but maybe they're kind of, you know, intervening to see like kind of how quickly they can be cut or something. You know, this idea of moderating or tempering the decrees of fate. Anyway, that's at least my idea. But yeah, I definitely think there's a connection there. Other questions?
I think that's it for now.
Okay. All right, so I will stop sharing and then turn us around like so that you can see my domestic altar area and see what I'm doing. I think that's pretty good. Okay, so first I'll do a quick ritual cleansing. And once again, if you want to take part and get your own offerings ready, please feel free to do so. Aquae per gratia Deorum corpore animum mentenque urgent. And I'll light a candle. Tieni huius loci. Adeste, Suleviae. Be present, Suleviae, at these rites, I pray you, that we may honor you. Asitis, Suleviae, Beae celebrandi. And may we all prepare a place of welcome for the Suleviae in our hearts. As some of you will know from having seen some of these presentations and rituals that I've done in the past, I do like to sing, and I don't necessarily know how to sing. So if you're truly musical, you may wish to run and hide for the next few seconds. So this first song that I've got in honor of Suleviae is actually a version of Calon Lan, my favorite Welsh hymn, which incidentally was my hand washing song during the pandemic. You remember when everybody was all like, oh, we can stop COVID-19 by washing our hands and never touching our faces. Anyway. There's a goddess steering truly all events that to us fall. Kindly may she turn her rudder and take pity on us all. Sing I now unto Suleviae, make my soul shine pure and bright. Yours the soul that to Suleviae sings by day and sings by night. Edamin galit birdo, edin pian gambosi, galit calon lamrin vevo, Andwin erubat forvir, Calon laman salmaioni, Ekachil nar livid luz, Vimunt calon lanascani, Anir diva chanir nus. Okay, we'll proceed then to the first offering. So, we got this ready. Suleviae, I present this incense to you. Deae Suleviae, vobis Hoctus praestendo, bonas preces, precor visitis, volentes propitiae, mihi, domo, familiae meae, paveatisque, omnibus cultoribus vestris. Macte virtute esto. And now I've got a sort of prayer thing in verbal form. Hail Suleviae, favoring goddesses, adored in many lands, from highest peaks to rolling meadows rich in horses. O Suleviae, listen to our prayer, and present amidst our cares, heeding and governing all that comes to pass. Short are the lives of mortals, often do we drift. Guide us, kindly Suleviae, on our proper course, and where fate decrees against us, mitigate its harshness. Help us to rebound. And look with kindness most of all on those who have had to flee their homes, and now fear and doubt where fate is leading them. Lead them to safe and comforting abodes. Hail to you, Suleviae. Macte virtute esto. And next, I'll make that drink offering of mead. Suleviae, I offer this mead to you. Dei Suleviae, vobis hoc hydromellem libando, bonas preces, precor ruticitis volentes propitiae mihi domo familiae meae, paveatisque omnibus cultoribus vestris. Macte virtutes. And if you listening would like to make offerings at this point, I will leave a few moments for you to do so. Macte virtutes. And finally, in honor of Suleviae, I'm going to share my screen again so that you all can join in the final musical offering. You'll recognize this one. It's a ditty by a composer from the land of Gaul, César Franck. So feel free from wherever you are to join in and sing along. So the lyrics are on this slide. Now, the original lyrics of Panis Angelicus are by Thomas Aquinas, and I'm certainly not Thomas Aquinas, but hopefully my Latin is going to be more or less up to speed. Ave Suleviae, Patorum Dominam, Regina Montium, Juno domestica, grate te colimus, est gubernaculum tuis, vita in mamibus, tuis, vita in mamibus. Well, what can I say? I'm not Thomas Aquinas. I'm also not Andrea Bocelli. Okay, let's see. Oh, I'll stop sharing then. And thank you, O Suleviae, for your presence, for receiving our gifts, and for putting up with my musical impertinence. Thank you, genius of this place. And in conclusion, hail to the Suleviae. May we hold them in our hearts, and may their grace lead us aright hereafter. This concludes the ritual. Pax Deorum esto. Let there be the peace of the gods. That's it.